Did you know that your social status in medieval Europe could decide if you even got to choose your spouse? Or that your family's land and wealth might mean your love? Life was completely out of your hands, even more than 1,000 years ago. From around the 5th to the 15th century, the rules of love and marriage were radically different from today, especially depending on where you stood on the social ladder. Number 11. Illegitimacy and inheritance. Consequences of having a child outside of marriage in the medieval era were like a social earthquake, especially for those in the higher ranks of society. For a noble family, the entire lineage, the very claim to their lands, titles, and power, rested on the absolute certainty of legitimate birth. A child born out of wedlock was a fundamental threat to this system. Such a child, often referred to as a bastard, held no legal claim to their father's name, property, or inheritance. This wasn't just a social stigma. It was a legal and economic disaster waiting to happen. Consider a powerful duke who had spent generations building his family's influence. If his recognized heir was not undeniably his legitimate son, rivals could challenge the inheritance potentially, even civil war. Documents from various kingdoms like the Anglo-Norman laws or the Edict of Nantes later on clearly outlined the disadvantages faced by illegitimate children, effectively cutting them off from their biological father's patrimony unless specific, rare, and often controversially clauses. These exceptions were rare and usually only applied to powerful individuals who could exert immense pressure. For women of noble birth, the pressure to produce legitimate heirs was immense. Their value in many ways was tied directly to their ability to bear healthy, legitimate sons who could continue the family line. Should a noble woman be involved in a scandal resulting in an illegitimate child, her reputation would be shattered, her prospects for a prestigious marriage would vanish, and she might even be sent to a convent or ostracized from her family to preserve their honor. The stain of illegitimacy was not just personal. It was a blot on the entire family escutcheon. Chronicles from the 12th century sometimes recount tales of noble families going to extreme lengths to cover up such births, sending children away to be raised anonymously or fabricating stories of their origins. The fear of having an illegitimate child was a powerful deterrent that reinforced strict moral codes, especially for women. Among the peasant classes, the issue of illegitimacy still carried social stigma, but its economic ramifications were different. While an illegitimate child would not inherit land, in the same way a legitimate child might, peasant families often worked communal lands or held tenancies, and inheritance was more about the transfer of labor in a place within the village structure. An illegitimate child might still be absorbed into the household, helping with farm work, though their position within the family and community could be less secure. They might not have the same rights to a share of the harvest or specific tools. Parish records, where they exist from later medieval periods, often note children born out of wedlock, and while these children might face social ostracism or limited opportunities, their existence did not threaten the fundamental power structures of kingdoms in the same way a noble bastard might. However, for the unmarried mother, it was often a life-altering event. She might be shamed, struggle to find a husband, and face poverty as societal norms expected women to be married and to bear children within the bounds of matrimony. The Church also condemned illegitimacy, imposing penance and social disapproval on those involved. The threat of illegitimacy, therefore, cast a long shadow over romantic relationships across all social strata, dictating who could love whom and with what consequences. Number 10. The handfasting and informal unions. While the Church increasingly pushed for formal public marriages in medieval Europe, especially from the 12th century onwards, informal unions, often known as handfasting, still existed, particularly among the lower classes. Handfasting was a term used for a pledge or betrothal, where a man and a woman would literally join hands and declare their intent to marry, sometimes in front of witnesses, sometimes not. For many commoners, especially in rural areas far from a church or without immediate access to a priest, this public declaration, followed by living together as husband and wife, was often considered a binding marriage in the eyes of the community. Records from manorial courts or local legal proceedings occasionally revealed disputes arising from such unions, indicating that they were recognized, if not always fully sanctioned, by the church's evolving doctrine. These arrangements were born out of practical necessity. Peasants needed partners to work the land, raise families, and share the burdens of daily life. Waiting for a priest, affording church fees, or navigating complex canonical law was often simply not feasible. The flexibility of handfasting, however, also came with risks. Without the church's formal blessing or a written contract, the union could be harder to prove if one party decided to abandon the other. For women, this was particularly perilous, as a man could potentially leave her and any children without legal recourse or financial support. While local custom and community pressure often served as a form of enforcement, these informal ties lacked the robust legal protections that church-sanctioned marriages gradually acquired. Documents outlining church teachings, such as the pronouncements from the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, emphasized the importance of public marriage ceremonies and the presence of a priest clearly trying to regulate these informal practices. Yet, the sheer widespread nature of handfasting before these reforms indicates a deeply ingrained custom, particularly where church influence was less direct or economic circumstances made formal marriage difficult. Even in the upper echelons of society, there were instances where informal vows were exchanged, though these were far more contentious and often led to scandalous legal battles. A noble, seeking to escape an unwanted arranged marriage, might claim a prior private handfasting with a different partner, hoping to invalidate the planned union. However, these claims were difficult to prove and often required significant legal maneuvering and the testimony of witnesses. For the nobility, the stakes were too high to rely solely on such informal arrangements, as succession, land, and political alliances depended on indisputable legitimate marriages. Therefore, while handfasting offered a degree of freedom and practicality for some, it also highlighted the differing standards and security of marriage across medieval social classes. A peasant couple might be considered married by their village through a simple handfasting, while a noble couple required intricate ceremonies, numerous witnesses, and the blessings of both church and secular powers to be deemed truly wed, underscoring how deeply social class shaped even the very definition of a marital bond. Number 9. Marriage as a guild kring. For artisans and craftsmen in medieval towns, joining a guild was a crucial step in their career, offering protection, training, and a pathway to economic stability. But for many, especially men, the path to becoming a master craftsman or setting up their own shop often included a surprising prerequisite: marriage. Guild ordinances from various European cities, like those of London's livery companies or the Parisian craft guilds, frequently stipulated that a master craftsman should be a married man. This wasn't merely a suggestion. It was often a rule embedded in their statutes. The reasoning behind this was multifaceted. A married master was seen as a more stable and responsible member of the community. He was less likely to be transient, having a wife and family to support, which in turn meant he was more invested in the long-term prosperity of his craft and his town. His household was also the nucleus of his workshop. His wife and children often played crucial roles in the production process, from preparing materials to selling finished goods. For women, marriage into a guild family was often their primary pathway into the professional world. A woman could not typically join a guild as an apprentice or master in her own right, with some rare exceptions. However, upon marrying a master craftsman, she became an integral part of the business. She would manage the household finances, oversee apprentices, buy supplies, and even engage directly in the production of goods. In many cases, if her husband died, she, as a widow, had the right to continue operating the business, often with the support of the guild, provided she maintained its standards. This effectively meant that for a medieval woman, marriage was not just about companionship or procreation. It was a direct pathway to economic partnership, and for some, independent entrepreneurs after their husband's death. Records from medieval Florence or Nuremberg often show widows successfully running their deceased husband's shops, inheriting their tools, and even taking on apprentices, demonstrating the significant economic role marriage played for women in guild families. This intertwining of marriage and guild membership meant that a young craftsman might actively seek a wife, not just for personal reasons, but because it was a necessary step for his career advancement. A good match could bring capital, connections, or even a skilled pair of hands to the workshop. For women, their prospects were often tied to the trade of their father or a suitable husband. A weaver's daughter might marry another weaver, ensuring the family's trade continued. This system, while seemingly restrictive, provided a structured form of social mobility and economic security for the nascent middle class of artisans and merchants. It meant that love, while perhaps a pleasant bonus, often played second fiddle to the practical necessities of establishing and maintaining a profitable trade, turning marriage into a business partnership as much as a personal union. The requirement of marriage for guild membership clearly demonstrates how economic realities heavily influenced the medieval love life for a specific segment of society. Number 8. The impact of epidemics, like the Black Death. The arrival of the Black Death in the mid-14th century, followed by subsequent waves of plague, fundamentally reshaped medieval society, and with it, the landscape of love, marriage, and family life. When an estimated 1/3 to half of Europe's population perished within a few short years, the survivors found themselves in a world turned upside down. The drastic reduction in population meant a sudden and unprecedented scarcity of labor. For the surviving peasants and laborers, this translated into increased bargaining power, higher wages, and greater opportunities for social mobility. This economic shift had a direct impact on marriage patterns. Before the plague, land was scarce, and young peasants often had to wait years, sometimes even decades, to inherit land or accumulate enough resources to marry and start a family. After the plague, land became more abundant, and fewer people were competing for it. This meant younger people could marry earlier, as they had more immediate access to land and resources. Records from villages across England and France show a noticeable drop in the average age of marriage in the decades following the Black Death. For surviving women, the plague also created new opportunities. With fewer men available and a greater need for labor, women found themselves in higher demand, both as workers and as potential spouses. Some women, particularly widows, inherited property and businesses from their deceased husbands, giving them an unprecedented level of economic independence and agency in choosing their next partner if they chose to remarry. Historical documents detail instances where women, previously reliant on their male relatives, now controlled significant assets, making them attractive marital prospects, or allowing them to remain unmarried and manage their own affairs. This newfound economic leverage could translate into greater say in their own romantic futures, even for a short period, before society began to re-establish its old hierarchies. However, the plague also introduced profound psychological and emotional shifts. The widespread death and uncertainty could lead to a carpe diem attitude, a desire to live life to the fullest and embrace relationships more quickly. There are accounts of people marrying in haste, perhaps fearing they might not live to see another day. On the other hand, the constant threat of death also led to intense grieving and a reevaluation of personal connections. For noble families, the plague meant the loss of heirs and the imperative to produce new ones quickly, leading to strategic marriages arranged with even greater urgency to secure lines of succession. Plague was a stark reminder of life's fragility, and it reshaped the very foundations of how people approached love, family formation, and the continuation of their lineage, demonstrating how a catastrophic event could disrupt and reconfigure the established norms of medieval love life for all social classes. Number 7. Widows' limited choices and economic favorability. For medieval women, becoming a widow was a pivotal moment, and her future was heavily dictated by her social class. A wealthy, noble widow, especially one who inherited substantial lands or a significant dower, a portion of her deceased husband's estate set aside for her support, might find herself in a remarkably powerful, albeit often temporary position. These women, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, who inherited vast territories and then married 2 kings, wielded considerable economic and political influence. Such a widow often had the right to control her dower lands, appoint officials, and even manage her own household independently. This newfound agency could give her a degree of choice in her next marriage, or even the option to remain unmarried, a rarity for women of her time. However, this freedom often came with intense pressure from her male relatives, her feudal lord, or even the king, who saw her as a valuable asset to be remarried for political or economic gain. Records of royal courts sometimes detail a king granting or selling the marriage of a wealthy widow, essentially forcing her into a union that benefited the crown or a favored noble. So while she might have had more resources, her choices were still heavily constrained by the overarching patriarchal structures. For a widow from the burgeoning merchant or artisan class, her situation was often tied to the continuation of her husband's business. As mentioned, guild rules often allowed a master's widow to continue his trade, provided she upheld its standards and perhaps did not remarry outside the guild. This economic independence was significant, offering her a lifeline and the ability to support herself and her children. However, her future security was still precarious. She might face challenges from male competitors or struggle to manage the business alone. Remarriage, often to another craftsman or merchant, was a common strategy to maintain the business and provide a new male head of household, offering stability but also potentially diminishing her personal autonomy within the trade. Urban legal documents from cities like Florence or Bruges often contain clauses outlining the rights and responsibilities of merchant widows, reflecting their unique position. Peasant widow faced the most profound economic vulnerability. Without a husband to work the land, cultivate crops, and provide labor, her family's survival was at risk. Peasants often held their land from a lord in exchange for labor, services, or rent, and a woman alone might struggle to meet these obligations. For many, remarriage was not a choice, but a necessity for economic survival. She might marry another landless peasant, a widower from her village, or even a younger man seeking access to her small plot of land. These unions were often pragmatic, driven by the need for labor and mutual support rather than romantic love. Manorial court records sometimes show disputes over widows, dower rights, or the reallocation of their land after a husband's death, highlighting their precarious position. The limited choices available to widows across the social spectrum underscore how deeply intertwined economic survival and social class were with the possibilities of love and companionship in medieval life. Number 6. The rite of prima nocte, or its myth and reality. Concept of prima nocte, or the rite of the first night, is one of the most enduring and unsettling myths about medieval Europe, often depicted as a feudal lord's absolute right to sleep with a peasant bride on her wedding night before her husband. This idea, while chilling, is largely a product of later centuries' romanticized and often exaggerated interpretations of medieval power dynamics rather than a widespread historical reality. While no direct, widespread legal right to prima nocte has been definitively proven to exist across medieval Europe, The idea of it or other forms of sexual exploitation by lords certainly existed in the peasant psyche and was a tool of intimidation. Charters and legal codes from the period rarely, if ever, explicitly grant such a right. Instead, what might have existed were various feudal payments or customs that were misinterpreted or deliberately exaggerated over time. One common custom was the marstagagium, or merchet, a fee paid to the lord by a peasant for permission to marry, especially if the bride was marrying someone from another manor. This payment was a recognition of the lord's control over his serfs and their offspring, as a marriage could mean the loss of labor or tax revenue. These payments were economic, not sexual. However, in some regions, there were vague references to sexual compensation or redemption fees paid to the lord by the groom to avoid certain theoretical rights. It's possible that a lord, particularly a tyrannical one, might have used his overwhelming power to demand sexual favors, or that local customs allowed for something akin to this in isolated circumstances, but it was not a codified or universally accepted right. Instead, it was an extreme manifestation of the lord's power over his tenants, a power that certainly included the ability to exert profound control over their personal lives and choices. Even if the literal prima nocte was rare or mythical, the underlying power imbalance it represents was very real. Feudal lords held immense authority over their peasant populations. They controlled land, administered justice, and could demand labor and loyalty. This power dynamic meant that peasant marriages and love lives were constantly subject to the lord's influence. A lord might forbid a marriage, demand a particular union, or exert economic pressure that shaped who could marry whom. The threat of arbitrary power, even if not explicitly prima nocte, was a constant presence. Peasant brides and grooms understood that their union and their future family existed within a system where their lord's will held significant sway. Historical examples from judicial records might show cases of lords abusing their power, including sexual exploitation, but these were typically regarded as abuses, not legitimate rights. So, while the dramatic image of prima nocte itself is largely fictional, it points to a very real and often brutal reality. For the lower classes, love and marriage were always overshadowed, dictating not just the circumstances of their union, but the very safety and well-being of their families. Number 5. Peasant marriages and community pressure. For the vast majority of medieval people, life revolved around the village, and marriage was less about individual romantic choice and more about the practical necessities of community survival and economic stability. Peasant marriages were deeply embedded in the rhythm of agricultural life and the tight-knit social fabric of the village. Unlike the noble elite, peasants rarely had the luxury of choosing a spouse based on personal affection alone. Instead, their choices were primarily driven by factors like the need for labor, the availability of land, and the imperative to form a productive household unit. A young man needed a wife to help run the farm, manage the household, raise children who would become future laborers, and contribute to the village economy. A young woman needed a husband who could provide land protection and a share in the harvest. Marriage was, at its core, an economic partnership. Village elders, family members, and the community at large played a significant role in influencing matches, often acting as informal matchmakers or giving their approval to potential unions. Timing of peasant marriages was often dictated by the agricultural calendar and economic cycles. Marriages were more common after harvests, when there was a temporary surplus of food and money. Engagements could be long-lasting for years while a couple saved enough resources or waited for land to become available, perhaps through inheritance or the death of a parent. Documents from manorial courts sometimes record disputes over marriage contracts or the payment of merchet, a fee to the lord for permission to marry, indicating the formal, albeit simple agreements that often preceded peasant unions. These records also show that the community had a strong voice in such matters, with neighbors and relatives acting as witnesses or mediators. The concept of free will in marriage, while championed by the church, was often secondary to the practical realities of survival. Community pressure was immense. Everyone in the village relied on each other for survival. A well-matched couple contributed to the overall prosperity of the village, ensuring fields were tilled, children were raised, and the local economy functioned. Conversely, a poorly matched or unproductive couple could become a burden. Villagers often looked for partners within their own village or a nearby one, reducing the transaction costs of finding a spouse and ensuring familiarity with the other family's reputation and resources. Gossip and social disapproval could be powerful tools in forcing conformity to community norms around marriage and household formation. Stories in local folklore or anecdotal accounts from historians describe the importance of community approval, the public declarations of intent, and the shared celebrations that cemented a peasant union. For the vast majority, love was something that grew out of shared labor, mutual support, and the hard realities of daily life, rather than a prerequisite for marriage. Their love lives were inextricably linked to the land, their community, and the sheer necessity of survival. Number 4. Courtly love vs. reality. Concept of courtly love is one of the most romanticized ideals of the Middle Ages, popularized by troubadours and poets in the courts of Eleanor of Aquitaine and other powerful noblewomen from the 12th century onwards. It described an idealized, often secret and non-physical love between a knight and a married noblewoman, typically of higher status. This love was meant to be ennobling, inspiring the knight to great deeds of chivalry, poetry, and devotion, pushing him to be a better person. It was characterized by reverence, adoration, and often unrequited desire. Literary works like Chrétien de Troyes, Tales of King Arthur's Knights, or the poetry of Bertrand de Born perfectly illustrate this idealized form of love, where the pursuit of the unattainable lady was the ultimate goal, not necessarily consummation. This literary tradition presented a world where emotions and personal devotion, however constrained, could be powerful motivators. However, the reality of noble marriage was a stark contrast to this romantic ideal. For the nobility, marriage was almost exclusively a political, economic, and dynastic arrangement. Personal affection, if it developed at all, was a bonus, not a prerequisite. Daughters were assets to be traded for alliances, land, or peace treaties. Sons were married off to secure powerful family connections. Records of royal and noble marriages from the 11th to the 15th centuries consistently show intricate negotiations over dowries, inheritance, and political benefits, often spanning years and involving multiple kingdoms. Young noblewomen might be betrothed as children and sent to live in their future husband's household to be raised, often meeting their spouse for the first time at the altar or even before. Their consent, if sought at all, was a formality often superseded by the will of their fathers, brothers, or liege lords. While courtly love offered an emotional outlet, or a literary fantasy, it rarely if ever translated into actual marriage for the nobility. Marrying for love was considered foolish and dangerous, potentially undermining the stability of entire noble houses or even kingdoms. The strict moral codes of the church, while condemning adultery, paradoxically allowed for the expression of idealized, non-physical courtly love within the literary sphere. This allowed nobles to explore emotional depths that their arranged marriages rarely offered, without necessarily threatening the social order. But the reality for a noble couple was a partnership built on mutual obligation, political necessity, and the primary goal of producing legitimate heirs to continue the family line and preserve its power. The stark difference between the poetic dream of courtly love and the transactional reality of noble marriage clearly demonstrates how social class dictated the very nature of love and companionship in medieval society, offering a romantic ideal. Number 3. The role of the Church and consanguinity laws. The medieval Church wielded immense power over marriage, transforming it from a purely civil or customary affair into a sacrament, a holy union blessed by God. From the 11th century onwards, the Church progressively defined and regulated marriage, imposing strict rules that had profound implications for everyone, but particularly for the nobility. One of the most able sets of rules concerned consanguinity, or marriage, between relatives. The Church's laws on consanguinity were incredibly complex and far-reaching, prohibiting marriage up to the 7th degree of kinship, meaning you couldn't marry anyone who shared a great-great-great-great-grandparent. This was a far broader prohibition than modern definitions of incest. Canon law, as documented in papal decrees and church councils like the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, rigorously outlined these restrictions, making it extremely difficult for noble families to find suitable marriage partners within their geographically limited circles. For powerful noble families, who often intermarried to consolidate land and power across generations, these laws were a constant headache. Almost every powerful family in Europe could trace some form of distant kinship with others, simply due to generations of strategic alliances. This meant that many marriages crucial for political stability and dynastic survival were technically illegal in the eyes of the Church. This didn't always stop powerful nobles from marrying, but it created a vulnerability. If a marriage later proved inconvenient, perhaps it didn't produce the desired male heir, or a more advantageous alliance appeared, a ruler or noble could appeal to the Pope for an annulment, claiming the marriage was invalid due to hidden consanguinity. Historical chronicles are filled with examples of powerful rulers like Eleanor of Aquitaine's first marriage to Louis VII of France, being annulled on grounds of distant kinship, conveniently after political needs had shifted. This allowed nobles to escape unwanted unions, but it also meant that no noble marriage was entirely secure if one party wanted to break it. While these laws were particularly ably for the nobility due to the high stakes of their unions, they also affected commoners, though perhaps less dramatically. Peasants usually married within their own small villages or nearby communities, increasing the likelihood of distant kinship. Parish priests were tasked with ensuring marriages did not violate consanguinity rules, and dispensations, special permissions from the Church, were sometimes sought, though these were expensive and less accessible for ordinary people. For the most part, though peasant genealogies were harder to trace beyond a few generations, making widespread consanguinity claims less common. The Church's intricate rules on consanguinity and affinity, relationship by marriage, demonstrate how spiritual authority could directly dictate romantic and marital choices, even for the highest in society, turning the very act of choosing a partner into a complex legal and theological minefield, all filtered through the lens of social class and its complex legal and dynamics. Number 2. Dowries. In medieval society, marriage was fundamentally an economic transaction, and two key concepts underpinned this reality across all social classes: the dowry and the dowry. The dowry, primarily associated with the bride's family, was a transfer of wealth, land, or goods from her family to her husband's family upon marriage. It was essentially the bride's share of her family's inheritance, meant to provide for her support within her new household and to contribute to the economic foundation of the new couple. For noble families, dowries could be enormous, consisting of vast tracts of land, castles, huge sums of money, or even entire villages. The size of a noblewoman's dowry was directly tied to her marriage prospects and the social standing of her family. A large dowry could secure a more prestigious husband, elevating her family's status or solidifying a powerful alliance. Royal marriages, in particular, involved intricate negotiations over dowries that could influence the economies of entire kingdoms. Chronicles and royal financial records detail the precise values of these transfers, underscoring their importance. For the burgeoning merchant and artisan classes in towns, dowries often consisted of money, goods, or even professional skills. A merchant's daughter might bring a dowry of cash, tools, or even a share in a trading venture, helping her husband establish or expand his business. This made her an attractive prospect for a rising craftsman or merchant, as her dowry could be the capital needed for upward mobility. Urban legal documents, like marriage contracts from Italian city-states or guilds in Northern Europe, regularly outline the specific assets constituting a bride's dowry, demonstrating its practical value in supporting a new household and enterprise. For women in these classes, a respectable dowry was crucial for securing a good match and ensuring their financial security within the marriage. The dowry, also called a dower or jointure in some regions, was a different concept. It was a portion of the husband's property, typically 1/3 of his lands or goods, that was set aside for his wife's maintenance should she become a widow. This was her guaranteed support for life after his death. The dowry was established at the time of marriage, and it ensured that a widow would not be left destitute. For noble women, the dowry could be substantial, granting her control over lands and revenues. For commoners, it might be a specific plot of land, a portion of the livestock, or a share of the household goods. This protection was vital, as women often had limited means to support themselves independently. Legal documents and wills from the medieval period frequently detail the specifics of dowries, highlighting their importance in securing a woman's future. Together, the dowry and the dowry illustrate that for all social classes, love and companionship were often secondary to the practicalities of financial security and the strategic accumulation or transfer of wealth and property. Marriage was not just a union of hearts, it was a carefully calculated exchange of resources that profoundly shaped individual love lives. Number 1. Arranged marriages for political alliances. For those born into the upper echelons of medieval society, the kings, queens, dukes, counts, and powerful lords, the concept of choosing a spouse for love was almost entirely alien. Marriage was not a personal decision. It was a fundamental tool of statecraft, a strategic alliance forged to consolidate power, acquire land, establish peace treaties, and ensure the continuation of a dynasty. From the moment a noble child was born, their future marriage was a matter of intense negotiation and political maneuvering among ruling families. Records from the royal courts of England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, as well as chronicles from the period, detail the complex web of proposed unions, broken betrothals, and politically expedient marriages. These negotiations could begin when children were still infants, with betrothals formalized years or even decades before the actual marriage. The children themselves had virtually no say in these monumental decisions. Powerful example is the marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most influential women of the Middle Ages. Her first marriage to King Louis VII of France was arranged to unite her vast duchy of Aquitaine with the French crown. When that marriage produced no male heir and became politically inconvenient, it was annulled, and she swiftly remarried Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, a union that eventually made her Queen of England and created the vast Angevin Empire, a formidable rival to the French crown. Her personal feelings were utterly secondary to the immense political ramifications of her alliances. Similarly, King Edward I of England arranged marriages for his numerous children to consolidate power with Scottish, Castilian, and French royal houses, viewing his offspring as pawns in a grand political game. For noble daughters, their value was often measured by the size of their dowry and the potential for a prestigious alliance they could bring. They were essentially commodities, to be traded for diplomatic gain. For noble sons, their marriages were crucial for securing borders, gaining access to resources, or ensuring a stable line of succession. Often, the young bride or groom would meet their future spouse for the first time, just before the wedding ceremony itself. Their role was to perform their duty, produce legitimate heirs, and maintain the family's standing. While some couples might eventually develop affection or respect, the initial impetus for their union was never personal sentiment. Constraints of social class meant that for the medieval elite, love was a luxury, while marriage was a heavy crown of duty, demonstrating how the very concept of romantic choice was dictated by the harsh realities of power and political necessity.